Science, early science, no question, right? You want to explain why the sun, does what the sun does? Oh, okay, we'll invent this story about a guy and some ponies and pulling around a ball of fire and all of that, right? Or we need to understand the season, so we're going to invent a story about Persephone and the underworld and all of that. But these stories are primarily about reverence of the gods. Why? Well, because the gods are everything we're not. Namely, they epistemologically have knowledge we don't have. Ontologically, they cannot die, which makes them incapable of worrying or having fear. Aphrodite can come back because she gets a scratch on her wrist, and she's really upset about that because Diomedes jacks her. I mean, think about that. Diomedes jacks both Aphrodite and Ares, and then later in Book 10, he chops off Dolan's head. So, I mean, Diomedes is one of these kind of guys, he'll jack anybody. But the gods will come back. They'll complain about getting a scratch. But come on, it's not like they're going to die or something. Although, notice, every once in a while, Zeus will threaten Athena and Hera. If you jack with me, I will send you down to Tartarus, and you'll stay down there for a very, very long time. But that ain't the same thing as getting jacked dead, right? The gods are immortal. And so on both counts, epistemologically and ontologically, the gods are just so far away from us. And yet, they look really human. They are anthropomorphized, right? They look really human. They love to have sex. They love to fight about having sex. They love to kill. They love to inflict pain and suffering. And then other times, Zeus will pull out his little scales and he decides who gets jacked and who doesn't get jacked. It can seem grossly arbitrary. I mean, you can call it fate, but let's just call it luck. And in the Iliad, that word sometimes, even in the Fagel's translation, enters in. Is it luck or is it fate? Well, what difference does it make? Because in the end, we're going to get jacked anyway. But the gods seem to have somehow control over all this, which begs the question, well, what are you going to say about these gods? I mean, what do you say about Dionysus, for example, the Bacchae, the play that maybe ends all plays? I mean, here is a god who legitimately leads Pendarus to his own death. He does it. And what is that death? To get literally torn apart and eaten by your own mother in the Dionysian festival. And the gods allow this? They seem to support this? How do you reverence these kinds of gods? Well, the Greeks would say, first you fear them, because they are arbitrary, and so because they're arbitrary, you don't have any control over the way that they're going to mess you up. So you reverence them. You sacrifice to them, right? You're always paying homage to them, but you realize that in a moment, Athena and Hera can get together and decide the entire city of Troy is going to get completely destroyed. Really? Because you didn't get one little apple? Seriously. I mean, this is really the way we're going to play this game out. Yep, this is the way the game gets played out. And Zeus will basically say to Hera, well, okay, but if you get Troy, then someday I'm going to get one of your cities. And Hera says, I don't care, take the city, I could kill us. Very arbitrary in their understanding of the value, and that's the first time we've used that word, but let's write it down now. The value of human life. Enter Socrates, who looks at all of the texts that we've studied, and obviously many more beyond the ones we've studied, and he looks at all these texts, and he says to the Athenians of his day, all of this must be scanned, to quote Hamlet's classic little line. I got to think about this. And it is in fact in the process of thinking that Socrates begins to challenge in harsh ways some of these ideas. At the epistemological level, Socrates will ask, what is it that humans can really know? And it will be, for Socrates then, an incredible, enlightening, no pun intended, idea that perspicacity is possible. Perspicacity. Outside, I can see you, outside. Inside, that doesn't mean I can see my brain. I can roll my eyes backwards and see my brain. Perspicacity, insight, means wisdom. And for Socrates, there is a special reverence of that word, wisdom. Sitting there at the center of the mall, the Agora, those wretched places where all that selling and buying takes place. And it's there that he sits. Why does he sit at the mall? Because he wants to critique the very idea in Athenian society that the most important thing in your life is teammate. The stuff you can collect. The Scooby snacks that you can collect. Right? I like to imagine it. Two young boys walking down the hall of the mall, one of them carrying an Abercrombie bag, and the old man Socrates sitting at the fountain, and he says, "Why Abercrombie?" And the kid with the bag says, "Screw you, old man, I'll wear what I want." He walks off. But the other kid, he sits down and he's like, "Dude, what are you jacking with my friend for? I wear Abercrombie too. What's up with that?" And Socrates says, "I could care less what you wear. I'm not interested in what you wear. I'm interested in why you wear it. Why Abercrombie? Like, for example, why not down the street to the Walmart and go down there and get a t-shirt instead of paying $180 at Abercrombie for a t-shirt? Or even further down the street to the thrift store. Or even behind the thrift store in a dumpster, the t-shirt nobody wants. Like, why Abercrombie?" And Socrates says, I think I understand why. It's about power. Because when I'm wearing Abercrombie, I can say to others, without ever saying it, "I wear Abercrombie and you." I have power over you. Because I can afford to do this and you can't. Later that day, that young man is at home shoving all his Abercrombie stuff inside of a plastic bag, and his mom walks in. "Honey, what are you doing?" "Oh, I've decided I'm no longer going to be defined by the clothes I wear. I'm giving all this away to charity, and I'm going to start wearing thrift store clothes." Whoa, Mom, what are you talking about?" "No, there was this old man down at the mall of the fountain." Old man? And in 399 BCE, Socrates is brought on trial. For what charge? Has he murdered somebody? No. Way worse than that, the Athenians say. He has corrupted the youth because he is an atheist. An atheist? Socrates will ask, an atheist? How can I be an atheist if all I do all day long is talk about the gods? Well, he does talk about the gods, but he asks questions like this. Do you really think that Zeus hanky-pankying all the time is worthy of our reverence? It seems to me, Socrates says, like, that is a story which probably needs to get packed away somewhere in a Nike shoebox and stay far, far away in a closet somewhere. Really? Do you really want the Iliad to be taught to young warriors who are about to go out and fight, listening to what Achilles has to say about Time and Kleos? In other words, Socrates has been critiquing the sacred texts of his day, and he has suggested, I'm not sure they stand the critique epistemologically, ontologically, psychologically, sociologically. For that, in 399, they will kill him. They will kill him. And the reality is that it makes sense that they would be the Athenians would be very unsettled by what Socrates is going to say. His defense will happen in a classic text written by that same young man that sat next to him at the fountain, Plato. After this experience, Plato is never the same. He's there in the audience to watch the Athenians accuse and convict and condemn, and finally to kill Socrates in 399 BCE. Plato later will write about it in a dialogue that we call apology. Don't be confused with the term. To say today, I apologize, means I'm saying sorry. The original meaning of the word apology is a defense, and right there in that very word is assumed the critique we are talking about of all those earlier texts. Challenged, Socrates, challenged by these sophists, these individuals who teach for money, these individuals who Socrates has the worst of disdain for, because they will take any argument and they will argue epistemologically that it's all relative. Whatever you pay me, I'll argue for that. I really do not care, because there are no truths. There is no right. There is no wrong. That's the sophist position. And the Socratic position will be the performative contradiction stated outright. If there is no right and there is no wrong, then what is it that you just said? Because it seems like that's a pretty certain truth you just posited. Socrates has, of course, done all of his teaching through the form of primarily questions. We call it meutica, the Socratic approach, the asking of questions. Like, what do you know? Like, who are you? Like, what do you think and what motivates you? Like, what motivates a group? He will say it at the end of the apology. The unexamined life is not worth living. which is fascinating. Because if you pick up the Iliad and you ask the simple question, who lives the examined life in this book? We jump immediately to Hector in book 6 when he talks with his wife. He's aware that Troy will fall and he's going to lose everything, and yet he's got to go on anyway. We jump to book 9 of Achilles and Iliad, and he is, of course, examining as well. What fate will he choose, one or the other? And yet, Socrates will point out that these early stories, often, individuals will behave without much real serious examination. That is to say, why Abercrombie? Of course, at the sociological position, and this for us with our study of Plato is one of the reasons we have to go there. For Plato and for Socrates, it's all a question of politics. Now, I get it. Living today, our first instincts are to say, oh, I hate politics and I hate politicians. But of course, we got to be a little more sophisticated thinkers than that. Because what is politics? Well, politics is just sociology. Well, what is sociology? The motives that drive the group. Right? The motives that drive the group. In other words, anytime you put two people together, that is a polis, a group, a state, a republic. The name of Plato's greatest dialogue. In other words, when Socrates begins to ask these questions about these stories, he will critique them, sometimes rather harshly, and in the process, he invents modernity. He invents the modern. What is the modern? It is the fallibilist position, epistemologically speaking. It says, I hear what you're telling me about Zeus, but don't make that an absolute argument for me. In other words, I have to reverence these gods no matter what. Why do I have to reverence a god that does all this foolishness? Really? Scales? Are you serious with me? Socrates will ask questions like this, and the young students will be like, wow, I never thought about that. You know what? That is right. Why should we respect authority simply because they're authority? Shouldn't we first of all ask the question, what gives them the right to consider their right? The answer is, of course, from Zeus, power. What's he say to Hera at the end of Iliad 1? You mess around with me, I jack you. Well, there it is. Politically speaking, there's our answer. If you're stronger than somebody else, you jack somebody else. It's the way the world works. And Socrates asks, really? Are you sure you want to live in that world? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because if 4 guys go to rob a bank, and 3 guys go into the bank, and 1 stays out in the car as the getaway driver, and the one in the car drives away when the 3 other guys walk out of the bank with all the loot, what do they say about the guy who drove away? Well, that wasn't, say it with me collectively, that wasn't fair, that wasn't right. Even bad guys understand the concept of right and wrong, sociologically speaking. In other words, dude, we had an agreement and you broke the agreement. That's the rules. Where do those rules come from, Socrates asks? And how can we make those rules in the first place? And, more importantly for our study of the Republic, how can we make those rules better? In other words, the human condition can be improved. That is the key. The human condition can be improved. We can make our lives, to quote Longfellow, sublime. And departing leave behind his footprints on the sands of time. That's a Socratic insight. The unexamined life is not worth living. In the Apology, Socrates resurrects the hero Achilles. He goes there. He goes there. What is he saying? You guys think Achilles is the greatest warrior hero of all time, but let me tell you something. Achilles was only the start. I am the true Achilles. Now, of course, how much of actually this gets said, we don't know because it's Plato, and of course Plato is going to celebrate his greatest teacher and mentor, Socrates. But we have a sense that whatever it is that Socrates said, he really torqued off those Athenians. Why? Well, this is his defense in Apology. The city of Athens is like a huge horse. You guys who are the leaders of Athens are like the horse's rear end. He went there. I am a horsefly. You are going to sleep standing in the middle of a meadow. It's lovely out there. And I come and I bite you on the rear end and I wake you up. For that, you should thank me and put me a huge statue in the middle of the Agora of the Mall as a tribute for the important work that I do. Well, this doesn't go over very well, of course, with the guys who are going to decide against him. Why? Because they're afraid of him. Why? Because he questions everything. Of course, there is a fallout that we have to put in our nose, and we will analyze it, and that we will call Western thought. There is a fallout, because when you start to ask questions and to critique, it's very difficult to come to consensus. Buried in our analysis of the political conflicts of even our current day is the understanding that's buried right there in the Apology. Socrates knew he was opening a Pandora's box, if we can reference that myth, that was not so easily controllable. But here's where Socrates ends. Let me explain where all of the four ologies come together, Socrates says. It's called education. It's called education. Now, we've had that view referenced in the earlier texts, but notice how almost all of those texts, the people in them are adults. We know that Orestes was taken away from his mom, Clytemnestra, after his daddy Agamemnon jacked his sister Iphigenia, and he grows up apart. We know that. But by the time we meet Orestes with his sister Electra, they're now adults. They're grown up. We know that Telemachus was a young kid, but when we meet him, he's now grown up. Socrates says the key to who you are is what you were. And in fact, he says that education, that exposure to information, the process of selection and deselection of information is who you are. Epistemologically, ontologically, psychologically, and yes, even sociologically. It all comes down to your education. So, the history of the West is the history of school. Although we wouldn't want to confuse our education with our schooling, it's certainly going to play an important role. That is to say, to learn to examine. Examine what? Your own life and the lives of others. If there's any value in the study of classic texts for Socrates, it's to show how those texts work and don't work. Or to return to our original mantra in AP English, we are the stories we tell, the stories we accept, the stories we reject. Come back and let's do a little study of the great Socrates. Thank you.